Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 27th, while I am on the mend, I am happy to say, and we are talking about The Haunting of Hill House, as well as putting some closure onto Lovecraft. At this point, all of you who submitted in paper number 1 should have received paper number 1 back with my comments, so I'm going through revisions at this point. So if you have not received a paper number 1 that you have submitted, please contact me. As you know, you all have the option of doing a revision by incorporating my comments into your revised version and submitting in both the revised version as well as the original copy with my commentary to my email, and that's ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu by the ending of the semester. And you should hopefully be considering what to do with your second paper, which is going to be very similar to the first paper. You have the same prompt with Emily Dickinson, and if you don't necessarily want to pursue that prompt, you are able to create your own essay topic as long as you approve the topic with me beforehand and you're addressing one of the texts of the semester. My thinking is that one of the later texts of this semester, starting from Dracula on, unless you wrote about Dracula for your first paper. So you wouldn't want to have two papers about the same text. And in terms of Lovecraft, which seems like it was so long ago, that certainly he's an option. And one of the things about Lovecraft that I find interesting is that unlike many of the other authors who offer us a naturalistic explanation, Lovecraft is firmly embedded in the supernatural. Makes sense based on the essay that we read at the beginning of the semester, Supernatural Horror in Literature. I've always thought Lovecraft was a little heavy-handed with his writing, that use of italics at the ending so that we can't help but miss what the monstrosity is. That said, I've always appreciated his short story, The Other, because I think from a symbolic perspective, that which is considered normal and abnormal is something that's embedded within the Gothic that I think he really captures with the idea of the other. And I'm not necessarily averse to his other stories either. I just admit that I think that personally Poe is a stronger author. At least that's my personal perspective. As you know, I have fallen behind a bit with the discussion forum questions. I plan on catching up with those responses over the break so that when we return from break, we should be all caught up for the last part of the semester. And for us, this means a transition into The Haunting of Hill House. So you saw the movie that I had assigned about The Haunting of Hill House, very much a film that I think takes great advantage of the subtleties that are involved in the English ghost story that Shirley Jackson, an American, adapted. And probably her best claim to fame is writing a short story called The Lottery, which you may have read. If you've never read it before, I highly encourage you to read it. Let's just say this is a lottery that you don't want to win. And she claimed to be a practicing witch. She had over, actually, 500 occult books. And local from Vermont. For the first time, we've got a female lead character, as well as a female author. Now, we started the semester with a female author when we were talking about Mary Shelley, but Mary Shelley gave us a very male-centric world. Now we've got a female author who's giving us a female lead. And we see definitely psychological instability as well as the possibility of supernatural or paranormal phenomenon. And Jackson's been called a master of suggestion, which I think you can see with The Haunting of Hill House, one of my favorite texts of the semester. And if you are familiar with some of Stephen King, you'll know that he also holds Shirley Jackson in high regard. And the idea of haunting, and it was one of the discussion forum questions, what would The Haunting of Hill House suggest as opposed to just The Haunting? And I look forward to reading your responses. It comes from the idea of home, the haunt. And there is a long tradition of hauntings occurring in physical dwellings. That was the impetus of the Dickinson quote that one need not be a chamber or home to be haunted. Inexplicable sensory phenomenon. And usually you will see these sorts of patterns. Mostly noises, not necessarily physical apparitions. Smells, tactile sensations, oftentimes cold spots. Poltergeist activity. So if you are familiar with poltergeist activity, this is, if not supernatural, at least paranormal phenomenon. There's a slight difference between the two. That paranormal could perhaps be explained through natural means. Things like ESP, for instance, or in terms of poltergeist activity, that usually it's centered around the household of a female adolescent girl. And that the theory or the conjecture is that the girl is producing the phenomenon herself, as she is experiencing all of the changes of the transition between girlhood to womanhood. That said, there's also been some suggestions that supernatural elements are involved and they prey perhaps on the energies of those who are weaker or more vulnerable or those who are disturbed. And that could be classified as a supernatural girl, or I'm sorry, as an adolescent girl for this supernatural phenomenon. And that said, maybe it's the idea of a haunting is just a kind of energy residue. So it's not necessarily supernatural per se, that a house retains a kind of memory. It becomes an almost psychic battery. This was the idea that Stephen King had when he was writing his very famous The Shining, which was inspired in part by The Haunting of Hill House. Or perhaps a haunted house is just a portal to another dimension. Lovecraft loved the idea of talking about portals. In fact, he had discussed the idea that angles in particularly were ways to get into other dimensions, and that this allows spirits to enter into the physical world. Now, the idea of poltergeist, this is a German word. Poltern means to knock. Geist is spirit. This is either a mischievous spirit or it could be a malevolent spirit. And some of the actions that oftentimes occur around poltergeist activity are rock throwing. And keep that in mind when we're thinking about The Haunting of Hill House. Odors, raps, physical sexual assaults, shrieking, spontaneous movement of objects. And also keep this in mind when we go to our next text, which happens to be The Exorcist, which also centers on an adolescent girl. And while it's usually centered on a female under 20, and I'm well aware that Ellie is older than that, Ellie acts rather adolescent and childlike, and even lies about her age. Rather than making herself older, she's trying to make herself, or rather than making herself younger, which is usually what an adult does, she's trying to make herself older, which is usually something that an adolescent does. So I think from that perspective, we can think about Ellie as an adolescent, and perhaps her unconscious thoughts or her repressed emotions of hostility or anger or uncertainty are responsible in part for the events that occur. Physical disturbances like flying, levitating, banging doors, rapping, thumping, assaults on the human could, in theory, be caused by the mind if you believe in psychokinesis, the paranormal idea that our minds are capable of much more than what we utilize them for now. So what we think of as supernatural does not necessarily defy the laws of nature. It's just we haven't discovered how to tap into those energies and to those powers yet. But I think the strength of The Haunting of Hill House is as a character study of Ellie. And Eleanor, also known as Ellie, was her mother's caretaker. And we know that throughout the text she's obsessed with her mother and the guilt that she feels over her mother's death. She lives with her sister's family. She is unwanted, unneeded, and she's very sheltered. Again, when I was talking about lying about her age, the idea that she is going to make herself older than 32 making herself 34 seems rather unusual for someone that age. Very awkward socially and also physically as well. She's a bit clumsy, certainly in comparison to Theo. Very much prone to living in fantasy worlds. And since we're getting the text through her eyes, it's very difficult to know what is reality and what is not reality. And after she was 12 years old, which would be the perfect time for poltergeist activity, this was after her father's death. So this is a possibility of a traumatic incident that might have spurred this activity. Stones fell on her house. Now, I had asked you to watch the film The Haunting, the original. There have been remakes that have been made. And as most films do, they take liberties. So that said, watching a film is never a substitute for reading the text. It's merely a supplement. And some of the changes, for instance, some of the character name changes, I've never quite understood. But I can understand, too, that for Hollywood cinema, they might perhaps want to have more of a romantic tension going on than, or at least a heterosexual romantic tension going on than what we actually see in Shirley Jackson's text, which has oftentimes been read from a queer lens, that Ellie and Theodore have some sort of a flirtatious interest in one another. And we get less of that in the film and more that Ellie has an interest in Dr. Montague. But I'll get back to Ellie and Theodore in a moment. In terms of Theo, we know that in many respects, she's the polar opposite of Ellie. Theo is independent. Theo is confident. Theo is graceful. Theo lives with a, quote, friend, unquote. And whether or not that's code for the idea that she's living with a same-sex romantic partner, we can't know. But considering the time period, that would have been the language that would have likely have been used. She has telepathy, and she's been able to identify cards in a lab experiment. And again, we can talk about whether that's paranormal, the ability of using one's mind in a way that most people are unable to do so, or whether that's supernatural, that which defies the natural order. But certainly we see that Theodora is able to pick up on Ellie's moods and feelings. And telepathy is basically the transmission of information without any kind of sensory channels. So the opening quote, which is also the ending quote of Hill House, no live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katykids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. And the idea that what is reality, what is sanity, what is insanity, the personification of the house itself, that the house is not sane. And then we're, of course, introduced to our characters. Dr. Montague in the text is a kind of almost ridiculous Van Helsing figure who is trying to merge science with the supernatural. He appears as a henpecked husband in the novel. There's a little bit of humor there with Mrs. Montague. He rents Hill House for 3 months. 3 is always a significant number because it's suggestive of Trinity. And he's forced, he says, to find assistance, unlike Victorian times. This is Shirley Jackson's little wink and nod to the Gothic tradition during Victorian times, where it seems that, as I used to joke with Dracula, it wasn't difficult at all to have a group of individuals just drop all of their daily responsibilities to go vampire hunting. That isn't necessarily the case in the true world, obviously. So he's forced to engage assistance. Hill House is in an isolated rural area. We already know by this point in the semester, isolation is a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. The house may as well be a stand-in for the Gothic castle. It's got towers and turrets and buttresses and spires and gargoyles, odd angles. Again, I can't help but think of Lovecraft. Personification, the windows are like eyes, the cornices are like eyebrows. Think about how similar that is in some respects to Edgar Allan Poe, talking about the eyes of, let's say, the eye-like eyes of the House of Usher. Doors swing shut. And I've oftentimes said that this text is a door to the psyche, so we can view it from a symbolic perspective. And in fact, we see or will see that as well with The Exorcist. And the circular nature of the house itself is suggestive of Dante's Inferno. If you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, which basically depicts a medieval hell, and different circles basically house different levels of sinners. And the tragic history of Hill House fits into the idea of the folklore associated with ghost stories, that there's some sort of restless spirit that is unable to pass into the netherworld, or restless spirits, perhaps in this instance. We know that the last tenant had died crashing into a tree. And we know that ultimately that will be Ellie's fate as well. All of the tenants have left hastily. The builder, Hugh Crane, his first wife died in a driveway carriage accident, which is similar to a car accident. His second wife died of a fall. Think about when Ellie is on the stairs of the library. And the third wife died of consumption in Europe. And consumption, tuberculosis, was oftentimes mistaken for vampirism during this time period, as we talked about during our studies of Dracula. So I think Shirley Jackson is using some of the folklore associated with supernatural elements in her work. And that we find out a little bit about the family themselves, that they're quarreling sibling heirs, the Crane family, about a house and the heirloom. And that's very typical of an English ghost story, is that there is something that's unresolved, some dispute about money. The older sister died in the house with the companion who neglected her. And the companion willed the house, or the companion was willed the house rather than the other sister. And ultimately the companion hung herself from the tower turret. Note the similarities with Ellie about being a companion. Note the idea, too, about Ellie and ultimately perhaps committing suicide at the very ending of the novel. The rooms in Hill House are named after colors. I can't help but think of Poe again, The Mask of Red Death. And when the group is doing something as seemingly innocent, innocuous as playing chess, I think that's also symbolic, because the house is playing a game with them, and the characters are much like the pieces on a chessboard and being moved about. And there is a little literary joke here. I don't know if you would have understood it or not, when there's reference to the idea of reading the novel Pamela. Pamela is an incredibly long and boring novel from the Victorian period. So the idea, if you're reading Pamela, that means you've got a whole lot of time on your hands. Mrs. Dudley, one of my favorite characters, by the way, she represents order. And she clears breakfast at 10, lunch is at 1, dinner at 6. I think they cast the actor perfectly in the film version that we saw. Just very, very creepy. Ellie, in addition to lying about her age, also lies about having her own apartment. And again, this seems very adolescent in some respect. The initial argument Ellie has with her sister is about the car. And if that isn't an adolescent argument, I don't know what is, about ownership and possession of the car. Notice how Ellie is arguing with her sister, just like the Crane sisters had argued with one another. Ellie constantly fears being left out. And we oftentimes get her internal thought processes that basically descend into more and more fantasy-like escapades. And she's always concerned about what her mom would think or see or feel, which shows this very dysfunctional relationship that she's had with her mother. And wonders what others will say about her when they talk about her. And is stunned to find out that sometimes they're not even talking about her or even thinking about her. At the very beginning, we know that Ellie runs into an old lady who's carrying groceries. And one of the things that the old lady says to her is that, she'll pray for her. And that perhaps illustrates how alone Ellie is. There really is no one in Ellie's life. Yes, she has family, she has a sister and a brother-in-law, but that doesn't mean that she's needed or that she's wanted. And while she was needed by her mother, she certainly wasn't wanted or loved by her mother. So this sense of continually being an outsider is something that influences Ellie. First of all, to go on this trip. And secondly, if you are a careful reader, you'll note that she took a box with her. With all of her possessions, which I think is quite telling on two levels. The first, that all of her possessions could fit into a box. So obviously she has very little. And secondly, that Ellie was never intending on returning back home when she went to Hill House, or she never would have done that. So Ellie sees this as an opportunity to escape. And we see how she lives in this fantasy world of superstition. She sees the word daredevil, and then she thinks about daring evil. And is that what she's going to be doing on this trip? And that journeys end in lovers' meetings. She continually repeats that. And perhaps one could say that Hill House ultimately becomes Ellie's lover as they are joined together. She seeks verification over and over again as if she has difficulty believing in the reality of herself. And she's constantly thinking about what others are experiencing. When she's on the way to Hill House, she sees a child who basically is being defiant, something that Ellie could never do. The child wants her cup of stars. And Ellie says, once they've trapped you into being like everyone else, you will never see your cup of stars again. That this for Ellie is a symbol of independence, something that Ellie's never really been able to do. And the setting, the first shining day of summer, that would put us on June 21st, the summer solstice, which is midsummer, which is a pagan holiday of fertility, and sex is suggested throughout this novel. And definitely Ellie seems to be sexually repressed, which could be another reason for poltergeist activity. And also, it's how Shirley Jackson incorporates her vast knowledge of paganism and some of the elements of witchcraft within her novel. Ellie turns left. Left is associated with evil. And she travels west, which is where the sun sets. So the setting is very appropriate. I love the definition we're given of fear in the edition of the book that I had ordered for us. This is on page 159. That fear is the relinquishment of logic, the willing relinquishing of reasonable patterns. I don't know if I've ever heard a better definition for fear. And Luke says we fear seeing ourselves clearly and without disguise. Maybe that's what Ellie is struggling with, is being able to see herself without disguise and not necessarily liking what she sees. So Ellie creates these stories about herself to try to compete with the others. She and Theo create these little fantasies that at first seem really innocent, where Ellie had freckles, was often sick with colds. She fell during her graduation procession. Notice Theo's story, the exact opposite. Theo attended private school, learned to curtsy, attended dances, performed an operetta. So Theo lived a life of privilege and grace, as compared to Ellie, a life of sickness and sadness. And Ellie continues on with her story, saying that she's in love, and she's an artist model, and she's living a bad and abandoned life, and her affairs are the talk of the cafes. And affairs can mean just her business, but it can also mean her sexual escapades as well. And both of those, I think, are applicable in terms of Ellie looking or searching for something and not even necessarily knowing what she's searching for when she goes to Hill House. So the graceful Theo with the awkward Ellie, the confident Theo with the insecure Ellie, the independent Theo with the dependent Ellie, the uninhibited Theo with the repressed Ellie. I mean, she thinks that wearing slacks is such a moment of freedom for her. And when Ellie asks if Theo is married, Theo at first responds with silence, laughs no. And then talks about how she's at Hill House because she had an argument with a quote friend, unquote. So that's Theo's reason for being there. That Theo's looking for excitement or escapism, while Ellie is basically looking to run away. And the quote on page 174 that I want to draw your attention to, that usually is referenced about the possibility of a romantic tension between Ellie and Theo, reads as thus. Nothing irrevocable had yet to be spoken, but there was the barest margin of safety left them, each of them moving delicately along the outskirts of an open question. And once spoken, such a question as, "Do you love me?" could never be answered or forgotten. They walked slowly, walking side by side in the most extreme intimacy of expectation. Their fainting and hesitation done with, they could only await passively for resolution. Each knew almost within a breath what the other was thinking and waiting to say. Each of them almost wept for the other. And again, this is something that the film doesn't really get into, but that's not terribly surprising. We talked about the film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and how it too skirts away from romantic relationships that might seem to be a little bit too scandalous for the time period. We get a lot of haunted house lore in The Haunting of Hill House that I'll talk briefly about next class, starting on page 70. So if you aren't familiar with some of the lore with haunted houses, you can learn quite a bit here. Reminds me of Dracula, where we're given the lore of the vampire. We're also given information about Ouija boards and planchettes. And this is something that we will also be revisiting in The Exorcist on page 187. It's, in theory, a way to be able to communicate with the other side. The phrase, "Help Eleanor come home." How wonderfully ambiguous is this, because we don't have any punctuation. And it's a great example of what happens when you don't have punctuation. There are multiple ways to read a sentence. Is this Eleanor asking for help? Help, Eleanor is saying. Or is this someone or something asking for help to be given to Eleanor? Help Eleanor. And this idea of come home, could this be Eleanor's mother asking Eleanor's help and also asking Eleanor to come home? Because remember that this is how Eleanor feels that she's responsible for her mother's death, that her mother knocked on the wall and she never came. Could this be the house that's asking Eleanor to come home? I personally like to think that it's all of the above, that Eleanor could be very psychologically disturbed, but that the house also is haunted, and it preys on Eleanor because it understands that she's the weak link. And again, if you know anything about The Shining, Stephen King's The Shining, you'll see that there are parallels. Now, Hill House is actually based on a house that exists. It's called the Winchester Mystery House. And in fact, it's referenced in the novel when Dr. Montague is talking a little bit about the house, that it's similar to the Winchester Mystery House, which exists in California. There's a whole folklore about how it was put together. Basically, the heiress of the Winchester rifle family, and who would consult with psychics, and she was told that basically because of the blood on her hands, so to speak, from all of the deaths of the Winchester rifles, that she would need to continually build onto her house to appease the spirits, which is what she did. I've often wondered if that psychic was someone who was affiliated with a contractor. But nevertheless, this is what Winchester did until the day of her death, and her house is this huge monstrosity where you've got rooms that lead into staircases that go nowhere, and lots of other very strange construction devices. And I have a brief video for you that I'd like you to watch. This is in section 14 in the notes below. It's 7 minutes, so I'm going to leave you with watching this video that talks a little bit about the Winchester Mystery House, just so that you can understand how that might be applicable to what we were talking about with Hill House itself. And as you can see beneath that, I have a flyer for one of the classes I'm teaching in the spring in interpersonal communication. And that the Surgeon General had actually announced recently that loneliness has become a national epidemic. And the question in interpersonal communication class, or one of the questions that we discuss, is could interpersonal communication techniques help to reduce that sense of isolation and loneliness? And if you want to know more about the class, let me know. And this is usually where I give you the attendance question. But I am well aware that we are on the cusp of Thanksgiving. So there is no attendance question today. I just ask that you watch the video on the Winchester House, and that when we return next week, I will be giving you some closure onto The Haunting of Hill House and talking about The Exorcist, as well as continuing to talk about paper number 2. And as I indicated, I hope to be all caught up with my responses to you on the discussion forum questions. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing better. And happy Thanksgiving. Take care. Bye-bye.